I met a man on an open road, two cold hands clutched beer and broken bone, crutches crushed a discarded blue bottle, cap flattened to his head leant against a wall, temple at rest, his stressed crinkled fingertips sprouted weeds, punctured crumpled plastic, vines sifting and strangling the spores, yearning for darkness, stark claws of green reaching for murky daylight. That's where I used to work, spoke his faded cardboard, worn at the withered edges. The rack rolled over and nibbled at the eye. The Ripening of the Ruin is a project located in Bedford, exploring the relationship between memory, the passage of time, and healing on an urban, environmental, and human scale, set against the backdrop of climate change. I propose a holistic rehabilitation centre located in a public park formed from the renaturalisation of the post-industrial landscape of Bedford's gasworks. In this, the proposal holds an ephemeral quality. It is not a simple rehabilitation of the human mind and body, but a rehabilitation of the landscape. As such, the design of the building cannot be divorced from an interrogation of its role as an object observing the performance of the changing landscape, and a simulation and reappropriation of the sense of memory evoked by the same scars of capitalism and industrialization that have left people with mental health and psychosomatic disorders. This is examined here in a drawing relating the traumas delving from capitalism to the typology of a messy bedroom, isolated from the natural environment. The process of rehabilitation hence involves a progressive reintegration of people into the landscape to enable both their own and the ground's recovery, with access to spaces charting their personal progress. Hence, the rehab can be understood as a machine for human rehabilitation and rehabilitation of the landscape. The processes are related, with the patients becoming critical components of the mechanics of landscape renaturalization, and the form of the building negotiating and subsiding to the conflict between the controlled interior and organic exterior. Over time, in its improvement of the landscape, the building slowly becomes overrun by its own success and is destroyed. Bedford is located along the River Great Ouse, with the site being an interstitial terrain vague, located surprisingly close to the city centre, between Ford End Road, the railway, and the river. As such, its hostile elevation of danger signs and barbed wire protrudes a slight sadness, communicating the sense of abandonment and deindustrialisation that upsets the surrounding area. An examination of the industrial past of this part of Bedford reveals a more landmarked quality to the site, something lost with the removal of the gas holders that used to occupy it. In this, the site can be interpreted as a memorial landscape, with the ground condition revealing a fragmentary mosaic of landscape of disregard, where tarmac, gravel, and old foundations both allude to the town and the site's industrial history and poison the ecosystem. Indeed, gas holders themselves are contemporary ruins, rendered redundant by modernised processes. Their empty shells are sublime simulations of memories lost with their removal. In its current form, the site is barren, with a few wheat trees and weeds communicating the dereliction of the ground. As such, the first stage of recovery demands a recovery of the landscape into something suitable for growing and reforming an ecosystem. George Descombe's renaturalisation of the River Aire project saw the excavation of a diamond grid of ditches along the route of a river in a manner that allowed the canal to form its own path and break up the soil in a manner to enable plant growth. A similar proposal seemed appropriate for the site. Removing earth to form 2-metre wide ditches in a particularly dense pattern around the more contaminated areas creates an opportunity to use the gentle slope of the site and the fact that the site forms a topographical sink for the rest of Bedford when flooded, to send increasingly common floodwater from the town, owing to the climate crisis, into the ditches, leading down to pools formed by 3 exposed gas holder foundations. In doing so, the water would gradually erode away at the harsh edges of the ditches, changing their condition into a more naturalised form, whilst also breaking up the dense contaminated soil in a manner that would allow for an easy planting of hyperaccumulators. These are plants that can be used to naturally phytoremediate the ground, as they are biologically predispositioned to take up the heavy metals and contaminants that scarred the landscape. When removed, gone are the damaging materials. The process of flooding and drying would allow the site to oscillate between a temporal wet and dry condition, creating varied spatial experiences between the growing trees and plants. On a more macroscopic timescale, this iterative erosion would create a much more natural form of ditches, and a remediated landscape with a thriving ecosystem, in stark contrast to the current neglected space. These spaces would lead down to the pools, bound by a mound of the excavated material, where the retained water would make an appropriate space for bathing. In this process, the remediation seen with the landscape unifies a civic action in the formation of a public park with a flood defence and a renaturalisation of the site. The growth of new plants and the beginnings of the recovery of the site mirrors the growth of the new structure, which seeks to, amongst other things, echo the memory of the past gas holders in its relationship to the streetscape. The location of this form was considered against an expanded ditch network, which allowed for increased space for plant growth, whilst also zoning the expansive landscape into different areas between and around buildings, which can be sequenced to create a theatre and a sequence of spaces moving between open landscapes into varying sizes of courtyard. I sought to use this structure to create spaces for multiple forms of therapy and occupation, maintaining a relationship with the landscape. The final iteration settles on a distinct zoning of the site, with the open network of ditches leading down through the structure into a courtyard of low planting, bound by a more formalised mound. This open area is separated from a denser forest of new willow trees leading down to the river. The round forms create a defensive structure that allows for panoramic views of the landscape and creates a threshold of privacy where the main sequence of courtyards are controlled and separated from the evolving surrounding landscape. The glue lamp structure combines a series of column and beam constructions of varying densities, which resulted from tests that matched the to-be-discussed program of each courtyard, with this page showing the materials used to eventually build up the structure into a rehab. Although the structure demonstrates a quality beyond its ephemeral human use in its relationship to the landscape, there's a distinct phase that accompanies its human rehabilitative function. After 25 years of naturalisation, one might expect the rehab to sit amongst a more renaturalised landscape, one it is immensely integrated in with its mirroring of the site's development. I sought to create a variety of spaces at different scales to engage in therapeutic activities that related to the landscape. Iterations of the design compared elements of the courtyards to different precedents and adjusted them to create a controlled yet theatrical sequence of spaces to accompany the temporal progressions of the surrounding ditch landscape. This sequence begins with a progression that takes one from a small enclosed courtyard below a small step-back Thule style courtyard that allows for the penetration of light, back up into a large, wide, open-walled courtyard leading around to the large courtyard of pools created by the mound, or down into the large hall courtyard, which embodies an unexpected delight in the act of moving down into a surprisingly large enclosed space. The perspective sections show how corridors are created by and at the intersections of the courtyards. The loops of the floor plans intersect in such a way that continuous cornerless corridors are created, something not enabled by previous rectangular iterations. In this way, the scale of the progressively longer loops of the floors can be used to chart the progress of a healing patient. They might begin by only being able to walk around one floor, but can move to larger floors, the whole mound, and soon the entire landscape as they progress in their recovery. As such, they can become progressively more integrated with the recovering landscape. This circular corridor for the earliest stages of recovery uses exposed beams and columns to provide a rhythm to the movement, whilst the green space from the terrace progressively invades the area in a manner that reminds one of the developing landscape and creates a meditative space, whilst this view of the mound around the courtyard shows a perhaps more natural view of the landscape along a walk landmarked by the new timber gas holder frame. This shows how compacted rammed earth and lime are used to make the mound. The pools indicate the building's larger mechanic role in water management of the site, with the canal creating a constant wet condition in the free pools, but where the sequence of pools in the courtyard allows the contaminated water from the site to flow in and be remediated by plants which filter the water such that by the third pool it is safe to swim in, shown here at the conclusion of the mound as a space enclosed by the gas holder frame and leading back into the hall courtyard. The plans of the building sequester various functions. The large courtyard contains a plant store for plants being removed from the landscape, whilst the large hall occupies a triple height space. The hall has a separate public entrance, as it made sense to retain a public segment of the building to match the civic notion of the renaturalised landscape park. The first floor contains a mezzanine for walking above the plant store, with larger therapy rooms and the library forming a raised gallery above the hall. The second floor contains spaces for art therapy and a gym, in addition to smaller consultation rooms. This floor has views out to the rest of the courtyard and, like the rest of the building, uses calming exposed timber. The other floors feature the walking corridor and more accommodation spaces. This shows how the spaces are organised in section in relation to the surrounding landscape. The courtyards have different thresholds of the landscape. In the case of the large courtyard, this reveals an exciting demonstration of the building's mechanics. In order to remediate the ground, the plants such as sunflowers and bamboo, chosen for their quick growth, must be planted and removed on a frequent basis. This process is enabled and articulated by the building. The walled garden creates a controlled environment for sapling growth, whilst including a gap to link it to the surrounding landscape. When matured, these saplings are transferred to the surrounding landscape by the patients. In this way, the process of remediating the landscape is simultaneously a form of therapy for the patients, giving them an opportunity to engage in horticulture. In this way, the building becomes a machine, animated by its human components who pulse in and out of it to create a productive, healthy landscape. This theatre of production is concluded within the plant store, where the process ends as the toxic plants are stored inside. This collage shows the mezzanine for walking, where the window offers views out to the landscape, and a viewpoint for the procession of materials in and out of the building. This recovering and changing landscape is what in turn results in the building becoming overcome with its own climbing plants, such as wisteria. Its pile foundations allow it to resist the gradual erosion of the ditches around it, whilst the green roof allows for green space to occupy the space outside the ambulatory. The sensitive and variable relationship between the building and the landscape is maintained by temporal changes. The accommodation courtyard becomes flooded in a wet condition, making a swamp landscape underneath and introducing the surroundings into the centre, emphasising the conflict and dominance of the form in the landscape. The centre of the courtyard itself echoes a Hakatulu, with circular public walking corridors creating opportunity for community, with an equivalence to the rooms not seen with rectangular forms. This was adjusted from a previous iteration to be terraced, which allows for greater communicability between different levels and stacked corridors, and allows for more light to reach the base of the court. This relationship to the landscape contrasts with that of the outward-facing patient rooms. Here, each room has private balconies for reflection and large windows to view the landscape, with its changes on both the daily rhythmic and time-progressive level mirroring the recovery of the patient and providing a rhythm to their experience. The construction uses a glulam frame for the cantilevering rooms. These columns are water-treated at the base to remain integral during the wet condition. Plywood floor construction is sandwiched between the exposed glulam structure within each room. The intersections between the courts provide opportunities for delight, where the structures of each court and controlled views of each intersection, such as here where a peek into the large courtyard from the accommodation courtyard is enabled, and where a forest of columns is created by the exposed structure in the corridor. This corridor provides a viewing gallery for the activities of the public hall for patients who do not want to completely engage or merely wish to animate their day. The space of the hall is animated by its relationship to the surrounding nature. The ramda floor is constructed similarly to the mound itself, with a drainage channel surrounding it to avoid it becoming flooded during the wet condition. The large dome atop the hall creates an awesome space exposed to the movements of the sky, filtered through the trees of the willow forest. As such, different lighting conditions may make it appropriate for different activities. For example, a food market in the morning, a sports or dance hall in the afternoon, or a dance party in the evening. Each of these activities animate the space for those viewing from above, and continue the civic intentions of the public park relating to the surrounding environment. Overheating is avoided by the lowest ring of windows being openable from the roof to allow for stack ventilation. The hall maintains a controlled but evolving relationship with the external willow forest being brought into the building through the glazed public threshold. Whilst the interior bears witness to the temporal evolution of the landscape, from the exterior the hall participates in an oscillating game of hide and seek. In the winter or early stages of growth of the willow forest, the hall is translucently visible through the branches, becoming more hidden as the landscape matures. However, this long-term hiding is punctured on a regular basis when at night, the lights from the hall allow it to reappear through the leaves and branches. The building's relationship to the surrounding nature and the elevation along Ford End Road changes with the seasons. Indeed, the building appears to remain a steadfast landmark amidst temporal colour changes and experiential variations of the months and times of day. At night, the building disappears, becoming an ominous or sublime echo of the past but gas holders on the site. Whilst appearing to resist the frequent harsh weathering and temperature changes of the weather throughout the year, the slow result is a greying of the wood and an overcoming of the site with the life enabled by the building's role in its renaturalisation. Indeed, this process of maturing provides a delightful and time-extensive uncertainty to the conclusion of the building. It echoes a ruin overcome by the thriving landscape ripening around it. The progressive flooding and weather changes, accompanied with the farming therapy of the patients, eventually creates a more natural wetland space across the site, with a developed ecosystem demonstrating an empathy for non-human things. While somewhat overcome with planting itself and becoming hidden in the more natural landscape, the building retains its defensive form and maintains its interior and the mound courtyard as a controlled space. Exciting moments are created within the landscape, making it still suitable for human-scale engagement with the wetland, the pools, and the forest behind the mound. The site has become a fully realised park, with the formality of the initial zoning being corrupted by organic growth in the open space in front of the building. The frame of the empty gas holder and the cladding in the large courtyard invite the growth of climbing plants that truly allow it to sink back into the landscape. In the creation of this park, the site is transformed from a neglected mass into a public space, connecting Ford End Road to the River Ouse, a distinctly civic action. This journey between the road and the river is marked out by the landmark of the empty frame, which emerges behind the now mature willow forest. This fully realised connection might serve as the longest walk facilitated by the building, connecting the landscape to the river, where one might engage in wild swimming, shown here with the bathing proposal designed earlier. However, whilst designed around human usage, much like any ruin, the proposal's state of occupation is perhaps its most ephemeral. As the UK's gas holders themselves present a living memory that will outlast the active life of the forms, we might expect the form of the rehab to outlast its rehabilitative purpose. Contemporary capitalist consumerism has not been sufficiently abandoned. As such, the world will reject us with rising water and forest fires. What might we anticipate for this site when future inhabitants of the world are exposed to the obsolete structures we hold so dearly today? This envisages the result of a flooded and burned out structure. One might call this fatalistic, but this is perhaps a misinterpretation. Degrowth might demand that humans, the greatest destroyers of the earth, abandon it entirely. In this late moment presents an optimistic moment for the planet and its non-human inhabitants, who might be free of its greatest oppressors. The building hence completes its resimulation of the process of use and abandonment of the gas holders itself, becoming an obscure object of past inhabitation. Amongst this, we all continue to exist. And so at this time, whilst the will to solve the climate crisis cannot be located, we might find a gentle opportunity to rehabilitate ourselves and the landscapes as best as we can, free ourselves from our ills, and stand barefoot in the park.